The metallic clink of handcuffs snapped through the cool night air as Officer Sarah Mitchell forcefully locked the cuffs around the wrists of a well-dressed black man standing beside a sleek black luxury car. Leon Carter didn't resist. He simply exhaled, his expression unreadable as Mitchell shoved him against the vehicle, pressing her forearm into his back with unnecessary force. "You think you can loiter around here in a stolen car and not get caught?" Mitchell scoffed, her grip tightening. Leon didn't flinch. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Bystanders gathered near the entrance of the five-star hotel, murmuring in disbelief. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene as the tension thickened. Leon lifted his head slightly, his voice calm. "Officer, I suggest you think very carefully about what you're doing." Mitchell let out a dry laugh. "Oh, yeah. And why's that?" Leon sighed. She was about to find out. Where are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe for more shocking justice stories. Leon Carter remained still, the weight of the cuffs pressing against his wrists, his stance unwavering despite Officer Sarah Mitchell's aggressive grip. The murmurs of the gathered crowd grew louder, uncertainty flickering in their expressions as they recorded the scene. The grand entrance of the five-star hotel stood just feet away, its golden lights casting a glow over the luxury cars parked nearby. This was not the kind of place where criminals loitered. And Leon Carter was no criminal. Mitchell, however, had already decided otherwise. She adjusted her grip, pressing Leon forward. "You must think you're real special," she muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Walking around in a suit, acting like you belong here. Tell me, how'd you afford a car like this?" Leon didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the growing crowd, watching as hotel staff hesitated near the entrance. Some of them recognized him, their eyes wide with shock, but no one dared to speak up. Fear of the uniform kept them silent. Standing tall despite the cuffs, Leon remained composed. This wasn't the first time he had seen officers like Mitchell in action. Quick to judge, eager to assert power over those they assumed were beneath them. But tonight, she had picked the wrong target. Mitchell yanked at his arms slightly. "You hearing me?" she snapped. "I asked you a question." Leon exhaled. His voice was controlled, steady, and "I'd suggest you start asking the right ones." Mitchell scoffed. "Cute." She turned toward her patrol car, tightening her grip on Leon's arm. "We'll see how funny you think this is when you're sitting in a holding cell." Just then, the valet stepped forward hesitantly, wringing his hands. "Officer, I think there's a mistake." Mitchell shot him a sharp glare. "Unless you're about to tell me this man doesn't match the description of a suspect in the area, I don't want to hear it." The valet froze, eyes darting to Leon, who simply shook his head slightly. A silent message. Let it happen. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the onlookers increased. Some were watching in horror, others with their phones raised, recording everything. This wasn't just another case of mistaken identity. This was racial profiling playing out in real time. A few feet away, inside a sleek black SUV parked just beyond the valet line, Lieutenant Greg Sanders sat frozen in his seat. He had arrived just in time to witness the chaos unfolding, but too late to stop Mitchell's mistake. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched his officer, his responsibility, humiliate the very man who had been sent to clean up their department. Because Leon Carter wasn't just a hotel guest. He was the new police commissioner, and Sarah Mitchell was seconds away from ruining her entire career. Leon Carter remained calm, his posture straight despite the tight grip Officer Sarah Mitchell had on his arm. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into his wrists, but he showed no reaction. The weight of the moment was not on him, but on her. She just didn't realize it yet. The growing crowd stood in uneasy silence, their phones still recording as they watched her escalate what should never have happened in the first place. Mitchell, still oblivious to her mistake, pulled Leon toward the squad car with unnecessary force. "You don't look so confident now," she muttered, shaking her head. "These guys always think they're above the law." Her tone dripped with self-righteous arrogance, convinced that she had just made a good arrest. Leon let out a quiet sigh, but remained silent. His calm demeanor only irritated her more. "You have the right to remain silent," she said mockingly. "Not that it's going to help you now." Just as she reached for the patrol car door handle, a voice rang out from across the lot. "Officer Mitchell, step away from him, now!" The sharp, commanding tone cut through the night air. Mitchell froze, confusion flickering across her face as she turned toward the source of the voice. Lieutenant Greg Sanders was sprinting toward them, his expression tight, panic in his eyes. Leon finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured. "Ah, right on time." Mitchell narrowed her eyes, her grip on Leon's arm tightening instinctively. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice losing its edge. Sanders didn't answer her. His focus was locked on Leon as he came to a halt, his breath uneven. "Commissioner Carter, are you okay?" His words hung in the air like a bombshell. Mitchell's body stiffened. She blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. "Wait, what?" She let out a nervous chuckle, shaking her head. No, that's not." "You're looking at the new police commissioner of this city," Sanders snapped, his patience razor-thin. "And you just put him in cuffs." A heavy silence fell over the scene. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, some people gasping as the realization settled in. Mitchell's confidence shattered instantly. Her grip loosened on Leon's arm, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words that wouldn't come. Leon turned his head slightly to look at her. "Still feeling sure about this arrest, officer?" His tone was calm, but the underlying weight of his words made her stomach twist. Mitchell swallowed hard, stepping back slightly. "Sir, I thought—" "You thought I was a suspect," Leon interrupted smoothly. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't confirm my identity. You didn't even bother to listen when I tried to speak. You just assumed." He held her gaze, his voice never rising, but each word cut through her more than if he had yelled. The cameras were still rolling. Mitchell could feel every eye on her. Her entire career was slipping away in real time, and she knew it. Sanders exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before stepping forward. "Get those cuffs off him, now." Mitchell's hands trembled as she fumbled with the key, unlocking the cuffs and stepping back. Leon rubbed his wrists lightly before adjusting his sleeves. He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. This was a misunderstanding," Mitchell stammered, trying to salvage the moment. Leon gave a small, knowing nod. "I'm sure it was." His gaze didn't waver. "And now, Officer Mitchell, we're going to talk about what happens next." Mitchell's throat went dry. For the first time all night, she was afraid. The silence stretched as Officer Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The man she had aggressively arrested, the man she had humiliated in front of a crowd, was none other than her boss, the new police commissioner. Her entire body went cold, and her breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career suicide. Leon Carter slowly adjusted his sleeves, his face unreadable as he looked at Mitchell. "So," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Let's talk about what happens next." His words weren't loud, but the weight behind them made the air feel heavier. The gathered crowd, once murmuring in confusion, had now gone silent, sensing the shift in power. Even the bystanders who had recorded the incident knew they had just captured something much bigger than a wrongful arrest. They had filmed the downfall of a cop who had just proven everything wrong with the system. Mitchell opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced at Lieutenant Greg Sanders, her eyes pleading for some sort of intervention, some way out of this mess. But Sanders wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked on Leon, waiting for his next move. Leon let the moment hang before finally speaking. "Officer Mitchell, let me ask you something," he said, tilting his head slightly. "At any point, did you think to ask for my identification? Did you confirm my identity before slamming cuffs on me in front of a hotel?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "Sir, I thought I was detaining a suspect that matched a description," she stammered, her voice cracking. Leon nodded slowly. "A suspect that just happened to be a well-dressed black man standing outside a luxury hotel?" He raised a brow. "Is that the description you were working with?" Mitchell felt the heat rise in her face. There was no way out of this. Leon took a step forward, his voice never rising, but the authority in his tone made Mitchell feel smaller with each word. "You made an assumption. You didn't verify. You didn't listen. You saw my skin, saw my car, and you decided I was a criminal. That's how you police, isn't it?" Mitchell's lips trembled. She had never felt this powerless in her entire career. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but the cameras were still rolling. There was no way to spin this. Leon exhaled sharply and turned toward Sanders. "Lieutenant, how many complaints of racial profiling has Officer Mitchell received?" Sanders hesitated before responding. "Several, sir." Leon arched a brow. "And yet, she's still on duty." Sanders cleared his throat. "Internal Affairs has reviewed the cases, but none had enough evidence to warrant disciplinary action." Leon chuckled, shaking his head. "Well," he said, motioning toward the onlookers holding up their phones, "looks like we have all the evidence we need now." Mitchell's stomach dropped. Leon stepped back slightly, straightening his tie. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice cool and controlled. "Officer Mitchell, you're going to be placed on immediate suspension while an investigation is conducted into your conduct. You will turn in your badge and weapon, effective immediately." Mitchell's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, please, this was a misunderstanding." Leon's expression didn't waver. "You're right. It was a misunderstanding. You misunderstood who had power tonight." The finality of his words hit like a hammer. This was the end of her career, and she knew it. Leon turned to Sanders. "Make sure it's done properly." Sanders gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir." As Mitchell stood there, stunned and shaking, Leon took one last glance at the scene before turning away, his posture unshaken, his dignity intact. The crowd, still watching in stunned silence, had just witnessed justice play out in real time. And for the first time in her career, Mitchell wasn't the one holding the power. She was the one being held accountable. Officer Sarah Mitchell stood still, her body numb as Leon Carter walked away, leaving behind a silence heavier than any shouting match could have been. The same people who had watched her arrest him were now watching her downfall. Every step Leon took cemented the reality that her power had just been stripped away. Her badge, her authority, everything she had once wielded so freely was gone. Lieutenant Greg Sanders let out a sharp breath and turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Give me your badge and gun, Mitchell." His voice lacked anger. It was just cold, final. Mitchell opened her mouth to protest, to salvage what little was left of her career, but nothing came out. What excuse could she give? She had humiliated her own boss in front of dozens of witnesses, and worse, it had all been recorded. Her hands trembled as she reached for her badge, the very thing she had once flashed with pride. As she unhooked it from her belt, the weight of what she had done fully crashed down on her. She wasn't just facing suspension. This was the beginning of the end. She reluctantly placed it into Sanders' open palm, followed by her gun, which suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Sanders didn't offer her any words of comfort. Instead, he stepped back and shook his head. "You had every opportunity to do the right thing. You ignored all of them." Mitchell clenched her jaw, trying to keep her composure, but she could feel the stares of the crowd still lingering. They weren't just watching her. They were watching justice. The same people who had once feared officers like her were now seeing one of them held accountable. Leon, now standing near his car, turned back to face her. His expression wasn't smug. He wasn't gloating. That somehow made it worse. "I don't take pleasure in this, Officer Mitchell," he said calmly, "but I do believe in consequences." Mitchell swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice quieter now, lacking the authority she once carried so easily. Leon nodded. "And that's the problem." His voice remained steady. "Because if I had been any other black man standing here, I wouldn't have had the power to fight back. I wouldn't have been able to walk away with my dignity intact. How many others have you treated this way? How many times have you assumed guilt without question?" Mitchell's stomach twisted. She wanted to argue. She wanted to deny everything. But standing there, unarmed, stripped of her rank, she realized there was nothing left to defend. The bystanders who had recorded everything were still holding up their phones, capturing every moment. They weren't just watching, they were witnesses. This moment would live far beyond this parking lot. Her name would be remembered, not as an officer of the law, but as an example of what happens when power is abused. Leon exhaled slowly, adjusting his suit as he glanced at Sanders. "Make sure the internal affairs report is thorough," he said. "I want every complaint on her record reviewed. If she's had patterns of misconduct, I want it handled." Sanders nodded. "Understood, sir." Leon turned back to Mitchell one final time. "Officer Mitchell, you didn't just arrest the wrong man tonight. You exposed yourself." He let his words hang in the air before he walked toward his car, getting in without another glance. Mitchell stood frozen in place as his car pulled away, leaving her in a reality she never expected. For the first time, she knew what it felt like to be powerless. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, her fingers twitching slightly as she watched Leon Carter's car disappear into the night. The low hum of the luxury vehicle faded into silence, leaving behind only the weight of her choices. The badge that had once rested securely on her chest now sat in Lieutenant Sanders's hand, stripped away in a matter of seconds. Her career, her authority, her control, gone. The crowd that had gathered outside the hotel slowly began to disperse, but their eyes lingered on her. She wasn't a feared officer anymore. She was a cautionary tale. The bystanders who had recorded everything now had the power she once held over others. She had been exposed, and there was no undoing it. Sanders finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You should go home, Mitchell," he said. No sympathy, no anger, just a cold, simple truth. Mitchell's throat was dry. "Lieutenant, don't." He didn't let her finish. Not tonight. Not now. His words weren't laced with fury, but they cut deep. "Go home. You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs. You'll have your chance to explain yourself to them." Mitchell swallowed hard. What was there to explain? She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her authority, until it crumbled in front of her. She had arrested the wrong man, but worse, she had exposed who she truly was. She turned slowly and walked toward her patrol car. It felt foreign now, like a reminder of something that no longer belonged to her. Just hours ago, she had been patrolling these streets with a sense of power, of control. Now, she was just another person walking away from the consequences of her own actions. As she got into the driver's seat, her hands trembled against the wheel. The reality of the situation hit her hard. This wasn't just a suspension. This was the moment her life changed forever. Back at the precinct, Leon Carter entered his office, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. Tonight had been exhausting. Not because he had been wrongfully arrested, that was nothing new, but because he had been forced to see, yet again, how deeply ingrained the problem was. He had spent years pushing for reform, advocating for fair policing, and yet officers like Mitchell still existed, still thrived. She wasn't an exception. She was a symptom of a much larger disease. A soft knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Sanders stepped inside, his expression a mix of frustration and shame. "I should have stopped it sooner," he admitted, rubbing a hand down his face. "I should have been there before it escalated." Leon leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment. "But you weren't," he said simply. Not as an accusation, but as a fact. Sanders sighed. "What happens now?" Leon exhaled, glancing at the file now sitting on his desk. Mitchell's record. "Internal Affairs will investigate, but I'll be honest, this won't end in her favor." He tapped the folder lightly. "She's had multiple complaints before. Tonight just confirmed what we already knew." Sanders nodded, though his jaw was tight. "She's not the only one, is she?" Leon's eyes darkened. Number she wasn't. "There are plenty more just like her," he admitted, "and it's my job to make sure they don't stay in uniform." Sanders didn't argue. Instead, he straightened his posture. "Then let's get to work." Leon gave him a small nod. This wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell anymore. It never had been. Justice had been served tonight, but the real fight was just beginning. Leon Carter sat in his office, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. The file on Sarah Mitchell's record lay open before him, the pages filled with complaints that had once been dismissed or ignored. Not anymore. Tonight had been a turning point, not just for her, but for an entire system that had allowed officers like her to abuse their power without consequence. That era was over. Lieutenant Sanders stood across from him, arms crossed, his expression more resolute than before. "Internal Affairs is already reviewing the footage," he said. "They'll determine disciplinary action, but we both know how this ends." Leon nodded, his gaze unwavering. "She won't wear that badge again," he said simply, "and if there are others like her, we'll find them too." He leaned back slightly, exhaling. Justice had to be more than one moment. It had to be a movement. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at her now empty belt where her badge once rested. The silence around her was deafening. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be powerless. She had spent her career believing she was untouchable. Tonight had proven otherwise. As the city moved forward, so did the fight for real justice. One officer down. More to go. Do you think Mitchell should have faced harsher punishment? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in justice, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories.